March 30, 2008 Malaysian Grand Prix. It's the second race of the season and the memory of 2007 is still fresh. The memory from a few months ago when in the last race Lewis Hamilton lost the World Championship by just 1 point. However, in Australia at the 2008 Grand Prix, his response came. Hamilton's victory in the first race of the year. That's why in Malaysia, Ferrari needed to react. And they did. Felipe Massa took pole position. Thus, the championship began to take shape, while the rivalry between Ferrari and McLaren was more intense than ever. Hamilton was looking for revenge after the disaster of the previous year. Raikkonen wanted to prove that his title was not just a matter of luck, and Massa at the front of the grid was trying to get into the fight. Everything seemed to revolve around the championship, but that weekend, something happened that completely overshadowed everything happening on the track. A headline appeared in the British media. It wasn't about any driver, it wasn't about any team. It was about the president of the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, the most powerful man in the sport. And the accusation was devastating. He had participated in a sadomasochistic orgy with a Nazi theme, accompanied by several prostitutes. Within hours, his name was in all the international media. The conversation shifted away from the championship, and for the first time in years, the focus wasn't on who would win the title. It was whether the man who signed the regulations, who imposed sanctions, who decided on the driver's safety, could remain in his position after something like that. Because if he fell, it wasn't just a name, it was the power that held Formula One together. And for the first time in a long time, that power was in danger. Today I'm going to tell you everything that happened around the most serious accusation in history, made by one of the most important, but also most controversial, men to have ever been in Formula One. I'm going to tell you about the scandal that almost destroyed the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, and stay until the end, because everything ended in the most tragic way that no one saw coming. The man at the center of the storm was Max Mosley. Since 1993, he was the one who regulated Formula One and world motorsport. And that wasn't just a symbolic position, but possibly the most important one of all of motorsport. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile decided technical regulations, sporting penalties, circuit homologations, and regulatory changes that could alter entire championships. And the president had direct influence over all these decisions. Mosley had been in power for over 15 years. There were internal disputes with teams, political clashes with manufacturers, and increasing commercial pressures. In addition, he was not a neutral leader, he was a political leader. His relationship with Bernie Ecclestone, president and chief executive officer of Formula One management, had been key in consolidating the modern model of the sport. And while Ecclestone negotiated contracts and television, Mosley secured the regulatory framework. One handled the business, while the other managed the authority, the paddock. Because even though he had made uncomfortable decisions on the other hand, Mosley was a man who had been married for almost 50 years and had children. And although his private life until then had not been part of public debate, nor had it been relevant, everything was about to change radically. On March 30, 2008, the British tabloid News of the World published a story that exploded not only in Formula One, but in the whole world. The publication included a secretly recorded video, and in it, Max Mosley was participating in a sexual session with 5 prostitutes who were physically and verbally abusing him in German. That was already enough to create a scandal, but the newspaper decided to go further. The headline didn't just talk about sex or an orgy, it talked about the son of a fascist leader, involved in a sadomasochistic session with a Nazi theme. In fact, the accusation was explicit. The gathering had a Nazi theme. To make matters worse, Mosley was a married man with children. And considering what the Mosley surname meant, the news exploded. But to understand the seriousness of the matter, a bit of context is needed. His father, Oswald Mosley, led the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. But not only that, Max's mother, Diana Mitford, was a close friend of Adolf. Oswald and Diana got married in Berlin in secret. He was already married to the daughter of a lord, and she was married to a beer magnate when they met and started a relationship as lovers, which led to the death of Oswald's wife and Diana's divorce from her husband. Thus, the relationship continued and culminated in a secret wedding to avoid scandal. Adolf Hitler ended up being the main guest at the ceremony, which was held in the apartment of the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Years later, Oswald and Diana were imprisoned by order of Winston Churchill due to their sympathies with the Nazi regime during World War II. And there, inside prison, the couple's second son, Max Mosley, was born. And with that family history, news of the world quickly connected the Mosleys' past with the present. Sex, Nazism, and institutional power. The images circulated immediately, and fragments of the video were reproduced and commented on by international media. In that way, the scandal stopped being just British in a matter of hours and became global. Furthermore, inside the paddock, the discomfort was evident. On one hand, some national federations demanded public explanations. On the other hand, motorsport figures like Niki Lauda, Joey Scheckter, and Jackie Stewart publicly called for Mosley's irrevocable resignation. And amid all the chaos, the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile itself called for an extraordinary vote to decide whether its president should step down. For the first time since he took office in 1994, Max Mosley's continuity did not depend solely on his authority. It depended on a vote and on whether the sport was willing to support him. Additionally, at the same time, one of the most high-profile and controversial trials in the history of the sport was about to begin. But first, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. Max Mosley didn't resign, nor did he apologize. Instead, he sued News of the World and took them to court. The most incredible thing is that the lawsuit wasn't for defamation, but for invasion of privacy. Mosley didn't deny that he had engaged in sexual practices with 5 prostitutes. On the contrary, he was completely outraged and said that by making what happened public, his privacy was violated. Thus, the case reached the High Court in London, and there, for the first time, the story stopped being just a headline. The court reviewed the full video, not the edited fragments that the newspaper had published. It heard testimonies and analyzed the context. Finally, it was confirmed that the sexual encounter did take place. However, the verdict was that it was private, consensual between adults, and not illegal. But despite that, the central point was another: the Nazi accusation. The News of the World based its defense on 3 parts. First of all, that there were Nazi elements involved. Secondly, that Mosley's high-profile public position meant he had the responsibility to behave in a certain way, and that exposing him was in the public interest. And thirdly, that there was a criminal element, because in one scene, Mosley bled after being whipped, and this act of violence was illegal. Mosley mocked that suggestion, saying that the pain was pleasurable and said, "I'd rather do that than, for example, jump into a cold pool." He also said he was surprised that his secret had come to light. "I've practiced sadomasochism for 45 years, and there was never the slightest sign that it would become public. And if it hadn't been for bribes and illegal acts, this wouldn't have come to light." Additionally, in his defense, Mosley said that the scene was in German because he could speak it, and because one of the women involved, known in court as Woman B, was German. Finally, the judge was clear in his ruling. There was not a single
suficientes para sostener que la reunión tuviera temática nazi. Tampoco se demostró que se hubiera recreado una escena de campo de concentración, ni se probó intención de glorificar ni trivializar el nazismo. Por ello, el tribunal concluyó que el periódico había exagerado. De esa forma, Mosley ganó el caso y recibió una indemnización de 60.000 libras por invasión de privacidad. Legalmente, la acusación que había causado el escándalo no quedó respaldada. Sin embargo, fuera
court, the damage was already done. Legally, Mosley won, but the real test was not in the court. It was within the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. Even before the trial was resolved, the organization called an extraordinary vote to decide whether he should remain as president. And, to everyone's surprise, the result was overwhelming. 103 votes in favor of him staying in office versus 55 against. That's how Mosley survived. He was not removed, he was not suspended, and he did not resign. But he continued as president of the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile until the end of his term in 2009, a year that, incredibly, would be even worse for Mosley. In that way, the scandal did not bring down the institution or the president, and the 2008 season went on as usual, with the champions being decided. And Formula One did not stop. However, the episode left a mark, and his name inevitably became associated with that accusation. And for months, the debate was not only about results or regulations, It revolved around a much more uncomfortable conversation for the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. How far does private life go when you hold the highest position in the sport? For some, Mosley was a victim of sensationalism. For others, a leader who crossed a line he shouldn't have. One way or another, Max Mosley was on everyone's lips during 2008, but unfortunately, the following year, people would keep talking about him, only this time for a much more tragic reason. But first, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. After everything he had been through, Max Mosley just wanted to finish his last year in office, 2009, in the calmest way possible. However, tragedy caught up with him. On May 6, 2009, his son Alexander Mosley was found dead from an overdose in his apartment in the Notting Hill neighborhood of London. But unfortunately, that was not the end of the tragedies for the Mosley family. Years later, on May 23, 2021, Max Mosley passed away at the age of 81. But what was most striking was that it was later made public that he had taken his own life. Months after his death, the Westminster Coroner's Court reported that Mosley had shared his plans, had a last meal with his wife, and left a note before taking his own life. The chief coroner concluded that it was a suicide and stated that she was convinced that Mosley had a clear intention to take his own life. In 2019, Mosley was diagnosed with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, a type of cancer that affects the immune system. After exhausting all treatment options, the doctors told him that he had a very limited life expectancy and he was moved to palliative care. The night before his death, he called his personal assistant to tell him about his decision. And, although they tried to change his mind, he had already made a firm decision. The next day, the suicide note was found. The cause of his death was a gunshot wound. The coroner added that cancer was a determining factor and that Mosley would not have made that decision if he had not been suffering from the terminal illness. That was the end of Max Mosley, one of the most controversial figures in the history of Formula One and motorsport. But the sport has not only been marked by controversies involving its leaders, but also by those of its drivers.
Escándalos de espionaje, relaciones amorosas con menores de edad y
racism and homophobia are just a few of the controversies that some of them were involved in. So watch this video if you want to learn about the 15 most controversial drivers in the history of Formula One and all their controversies.